Good day. I'm Mark Andrew Holacek, philosopher, historian, Thomas Jefferson scholar. And today I'd like to take the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's narrative concerning Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, based presumably very much on the avowed relationship Jefferson had with Sally Hemings, and expose it to critical scientific analysis. And I think the results will be rather astonishing. They have, for 20 years, asserted that Thomas Jefferson was the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, and that's always puzzled me because I still think that Thomas Jefferson fathered none of Sally Hemings' children. And yet, as of June 2018, they've declared it a fact. They've removed all qualifying language. Thomas Jefferson just is the father. They're not even going to entertain any doubts thereafter. It's always been a puzzling claim, because if any hypothesis is genuinely scientific, even if it has ascended to law, it still can be refuted. Even laws of natural science have been shown over time to be false, like Newton's law of gravitation and so forth. Okay, so I want to start with philosopher Karl Popper's thoughts on science. He thought science was not an inductive process. It wasn't a matter of having a hypothesis and exposing it to tests, and if it came out positive, the hypothesis would be confirmed. Let's take something rather simple, like all swans are white. That hypothesis seemingly is abundantly confirmed. All I have to do is look for additional swans. I go out to the local park, I see additional white swans, and it confirms it. If I go to the zoo and check out their swans, if they're white, the hypothesis is more and more confirmed. If there's no disconfirmatory evidence, if I don't, for example, see a brown swan, then the hypothesis is confirmed. And what Popper thought is that there are certain theories that just were too easily confirmed, and there were problems with these theories. And he had in mind Adlerian individual psychology, Freudian psychodynamics, and Karl Marx's theory of history. The problem he noted is that everything seemed to confirm these theories, no matter what sort of test you put it to. The theories would always come out shiningly. The tests would be instances of confirmation, not disconfirmation. And a good example is Freudian psychodynamics. I've been studying Freud for over 30 years, and Freud was always want to meet challenges with his theory of repression and psychosexual repression. People would say, if they would challenge the view and say, I can't see how all human behavior is built on human psychosexual dynamism, challenging the theory of repression, Freud would say, your instance of anger, your instance of trying to challenge my theory is just proof of the theory that you are psychosexually repressed. Otherwise, you wouldn't be challenging my theory. So Popper said, and rightly so, that for a theory to be genuinely scientific, it has to have risky predictions. And he brought to bear Einstein's 1915 general theory of relativity. Now, Einstein posited that any body in space would warp the space around it, and so any body or anything passing by it would change its path ever so slightly. And that theory was put to the test in 1919 by a solar eclipse that was about to happen. And the notion is that there would be, behind the eclipsed sun, light of the sun, there would be a star at such and such a position that should not appear, because it would be directly behind the sun. And yet, if the theory was true, then the light that was coming from the star directly behind would actually come, and as it traversed by the sun, would actually be bent by a certain degree. And what was done at the time is trying to measure the bent and trying to measure the degree to which space was bent. And as it turned out, the theory was confirmed that the light did bend in space, and the star was visible at the time. So the theory was confirmed. Now, what I want to do here is expose the Thomas Jefferson narrative proposed by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation to scientific criticism by testing its main hypothesis, which I'll rather humbly with a rather informally called the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. Namely, all of Sally Hemings' children were fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Is that hypothesis true? What is the evidence that they put forth on behalf of the hypothesis? Now, the model, given that Jefferson was presumably the father of all of Sally Hemings' children, the model, of course, that they base, and it's been widely influential, is that, one, Thomas Jefferson's a hypocrite, Thomas Jefferson's a racist, Thomas Jefferson might even have raped Sally Hemings. At least that's the question they pose on the poster outside of the Sally Hemings room. I've always found this rather disgusting because in my research on Thomas Jefferson, he was not a rapist, he was not a hypocrite, and he was not a racist. So the modus operandi I propose to you today is this. I want to critically examine the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis, that Thomas Jefferson fathered all of Sally Hemings' children. I'm going to treat the work of lawyer Annette Gordon-Reed as part of the model that the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has constructed. And I want to ask the rather intriguing question, since the Thomas Jefferson Foundation has declared in June of 2018 that we're going to move all qualifying language, that Thomas Jefferson is just, in fact, the father of all of Sally Hemings' children. I want to say, how has the hypothesis, Thomas Jefferson hypothesis, become law or law-like? It's an intriguing question. All right, so the first part is titled From Hypothesis to Law, and it's a sort of introduction. Now, we do know that Sally Hemings had perhaps 6 children. We do know she had 5 children, perhaps 6, maybe even 7. The first child of which we know was Harriet, born in 1795, who lived 2 years. The second, Beverly, born in 1798. There's perhaps another, but we don't know for sure. Then there was a second Harriet, born in 1801. This Harriet lived to adulthood. Then we have the 2 famous boys, Madison, born in 1805, who gave us a famous testimony in 1873, declaring Jefferson is my father. And then we have Eston, who was in 1808, born in 1808, and, you know, as we'll see, a DNA study showed that Eston Hemings had the Jefferson Y chromosome in him. I'll explain what that means in just a bit. Okay, in 1998, a pathologist by the name of Eugene Foster headed a DNA study on Thomas Jefferson. Now, what they found is that Eston Hemings was the last child of Sally Hemings, had the Thomas Jefferson Y chromosome. What does that mean? That means Thomas Jefferson or some other male in the line of Jefferson, in Jefferson male line, is the father. Could be Jefferson's brother, one of Jefferson's brother's sons, or an uncle, whatever. Just any male in the Jefferson lineage. There was also a long oral tradition that one of the brothers, Carr, or perhaps both of the brothers, were fathers of Sally Hemings' children, perhaps Peter Carr or Samuel Carr. Now, that turned out in the case of Eston Hemings to be false. Now, none of the other children other than Eston was tested. We need to say that right now. So we know that Peter and Samuel Carr were not fathers of Eston Hemings. Then there was a loud oral tradition that Thomas Woodson, presumably a child that was conceived while Jefferson and Sally Hemings were in France from a period of 5 years, that Thomas Woodson was that famous missing child. I said there might have been another child before the first Harriet. Now, offspring in the line of Thomas Woodson's were tested, and we found definitely that there was no link between Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Woodson. Now, in June of 2018, the foundation they went and they discovered Sally Hemings' room. That's the question. I always thought it was kind of funny. Why is it so important to renovate or find Sally Hemings' room? Now, Fraser Neiman of heading archaeology there at the foundation says, well, we don't know if this really was Sally Hemings' room, the room that they're reconstructing, but for all intents and purposes, let's just craft the room. Why was it so important to rebuild, restructure the room where Sally Hemings presumably lived? And she certainly didn't live alone, probably lived with a sister. And that always bothered me because she's always, in my research, she's always been a rather insignificant player. But anyways, Leslie Bowman, who is the president of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, said famously in June of 2018, in a new exhibit exploring the life of Sally Hemings, her choices, and her connection to Thomas Jefferson, as well as in updates to our related online materials and print publications, the foundations will henceforth assert what the evidence indicates and eliminate qualifying language related to the paternity of Eston Hemings, as well as that related to Sally Hemings' 3 other surviving children, whose descendants were not part of the 1998 DNA study. What that means is that eliminate qualifying language, they're taking it as fact. They're not going to entertain any doubt after this. Now, I want to expose the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis to scientific scrutiny. Okay? Note, treating the hypothesis as fact is tantamount to saying that the hypothesis has been superabundantly confirmed and never disconfirmed. There has never been any commodious evidence for the hypothesis, so you might as well treat it just like a natural law. And I might even say, as I said before, natural laws are not sacrosanct. Natural laws, if an instance disconfirmatory evidence comes along, a natural law can lose its status as a natural law. Now, there are 3 types of scientific hypotheses. The first is a theoretical hypothesis. A theoretical hypothesis, all x's are y's. A universal scope, like E equals mc squared fits the mold, and the law of inertia. All bodies traveling, all bodies traveling in empty space. If they're moving, they will, if nothing impedes their motion. If they're in empty space, they'll continue to be in motion. If they're at rest, they'll stay at rest. That's a universal claim. Statistical hypotheses, x% of all x's are y's, and there are causal hypotheses, that x is the cause of y. Okay? Now, the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis fits neatly as a theoretical hypothesis in asserting all of the children of Sally Hemings are children that Thomas Jefferson fathered. So I'm going to treat this as a theoretical hypothesis. Now, one might envision a couple of objections. Is it gratuitous to treat the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis as a scientific hypothesis? The answer is no, because a scientific hypothesis can be about anything. And in a matter of fact, it could be, there are scientific hypotheses that seemingly are rather silly, but they're still scientific. One such study was undertaken to see whether alcohol has an effect on people seeing members of the opposite sex as more beautiful. And of course, the answer was yes, is that the more people drank in some measure, the more beautiful members of the opposite sex became. So that's a rather mundane and obvious conclusion, but money was spent to test that. So hypotheses can be about anything, and there's no reason why we can't treat the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis as a scientific hypothesis. Now, on the other hand, one might object that Holacek, you're treating the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis, you're affording it, giving it law-like status. Now, you can't really do that. They're not doing that at Monticello. Of course they are. They've gone a step farther, it seems to me. They say we're treating it as fact, right? We're not even going to say it's a law, because even laws, as steady as they are, as abundantly and superabundantly confirmed as they are, can be proven false. We're going to treat it as a law. And that seems to me problematic. Okay. Now, there are numerous tests for the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. I'm going to throw out 6. First, if the hypothesis is true, then Sally Hemings' children will have 50% of their DNA from Thomas Jefferson, 50% from Sally, and the children of those children will have 25% of Thomas Jefferson's DNA, 25%, and then the children of those children, 12.5% and 6.25%, and so on. So with new methods, autosomal methods of testing DNA today, we can get relatively reasonable DNA evidence to make informed judgments, so far as we're not testing too far into the past. Secondly, if the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis is true, then all of Sally Hemings' male children will have the Jefferson Y chromosome, We found that in Eston Hemings. It doesn't implicate Jefferson necessarily, but just that could be Jefferson, or it could be his brother, could be his brother's children, and so forth. 3, if the Jefferson hypothesis is true, then Sally Hemings and Thomas Jefferson will have been together roughly 9 months prior to the birth of each child. Okay. 4, if the hypothesis is true, then Sally Hemings will not have had a child by any other lover. Now, this is just a deductive consequence of the first prediction. If the hypothesis is true, this is 5th, then the brothers Carr, commonly cited as paramours of Hemings, will be exculpated of paternity. Remember, the hypothesis says all the children were fathered by Sally. It's a rather strong claim. 6th, if the hypothesis is true, then the children of Sally Hemings would bear some resemblance in some aspects to both Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Okay, now again, I note that the hypothesis, Thomas Jefferson hypothesis, is a very strong claim given the biological data, which just shows that Thomas Jefferson could be the father of Eston Hemings, the other male children. None of the other children were tested, right? And so the hypothesis is stating that the other children are definitely fathered by Thomas Jefferson. Okay, now secondly, if we find that there's little evidence for the claim, that there are relevant data inconsistent with the hypothesis, or that there are more attractive alternative hypotheses than the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. And this is the key here. We must try to understand why the Thomas Jefferson Foundation treats the hypothesis as a fact. And I'm going to show you that this is the case. There's little evidence, right? There are more attractive alternative hypotheses, right? There are relevant data that are inconsistent with the hypothesis that the foundation does not care. Now let's look at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation's case for the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. They rely abundantly and heavily, axially, I want to say, on Madison Hemings, the second from the last child born in 1805, the testimony that he gave in the Pike County Republican in Chillicothe, Ohio, on March 13, 1873. This article was titled, Life Among the Lowly 1. There would be a series of testimonies, interviews, whatever you want to call them, set up to boost a paper that wasn't doing so well. And this was going to be a bombshell. Why? Because in this testimony, Madison Hemings claims that Jefferson was his father and the father of his siblings. Okay, so Madison makes a number of claims. He says John Wales was the father of Sally Hemings. If that John Wales was the father of Jefferson's wife. So basically Madison claimed that Jefferson's wife, who's dead at this, Jefferson's dead at this time too, Jefferson's wife was fathered by the father of, Sally Hemings was fathered by the wife of Thomas Jefferson. And it's a pretty big claim. And there probably seems to be biological evidence for that. Okay, the second claim he makes is that Jefferson had an affair with Sally Hemings while in France. Now, Sally Hemings came to France roughly in the last 2 years of Jefferson being in France. And she comes there. Jefferson didn't even know she was coming. He asked for an older woman to come and attend to his, Maria was being, his youngest child was being sent, was 8 at the time. Sally Hemings comes and she's 14. And, okay, so she claims that sometime between the ages of 14 and 16 for Sally Hemings, Thomas Jefferson, who was 30 years older, fell madly in love with this child and had an affair with her. Okay, now he said Sally Hemings, he goes on to say, wanted to remain in France. And Jefferson objected vehemently. Jefferson loved her so dearly, he said, you have to stay with me, Sally Hemings. So they negotiated. And they pledged, and she promised that she would go back with him if all of her children were freed upon reaching their 21st birthday. Jefferson seemed to agree. Very strange thing that a slave, a young child, who would negotiate with someone like Thomas Jefferson, one of the most intelligent men in the world of his day, and that Jefferson would fall madly in love with her. Okay. He also claimed that Sally Hemings became pregnant in France and gave birth to a child upon returning to Virginia shortly thereafter, and the child died. There's no evidence of that whatsoever. Okay. He also claimed that not only was Jefferson his father, but the father of his siblings, Beverly, Harriet, Madison himself, Madison, and Eston. He also claimed that his name was got when Dolly Madison, on a visit to Monticello, begged Sally Hemings to name the child Madison when she was pregnant. And she promised a fine present. Now, that's very suspicious because Dolly Madison's husband, James, was in Washington at the time, and she was almost always with her husband. So it's unlikely she was at Monticello. And we can even say if she were at Monticello, why would it be such a privilege? Why would, the language is begging. Why would Dolly Madison beg Sally Hemings to name the child after her, after her husband? And it seems sort of demeaning thing, as if it would be a great privilege for her to be, for the child to be named, right? And then Madison Hemings claimed that he was educated by inducing, I quote here, inducing the white children to teach me the letters and something more. And, he adds, by picking up things here and there. He claims that, and that seems to be, you might learn the rudiments of reading and writing, but, for this important testimony to occur in the Pike County Republican and be written so rather eloquently, it certainly shows that Samuel Wetmore, the editor, wrote the piece and not Madison. Okay, he claims that Thomas Jefferson had little taste for agricultural pursuits. Clearly just a false claim. Jefferson had great taste for agricultural pursuits, he just wasn't very good at agriculture. Why? He was so heavily involved in politics and law and scientific pursuits and all the other things, and writing letters and all the other things in which he was engaged, that he had little time to attend to farming matters. But he clearly thought agriculture was the most important of the fine arts, if we consider agriculture, like gardening. It says in numerous writings that agriculture is the most important occupation for human being because it feeds people and it gives people a regard for the land. And finally he says, Thomas Jefferson was not in the habit of showing partiality or fatherly affection to us children. And it's probably true, but it's simply answered by noting that Jefferson probably wasn't the father of Sally Hemings' children. So why is he going to show partiality? Jefferson's account books, his memoranda books, show that to Sally Hemings, he gave no special attention to Sally Hemings. That's a very important thing. No special attention. She was just another of the Hemings slaves. And no special attention to Sally Hemings' children. That can easily be explained if he's not the father. Now we have Annette Gordon Reed, who now has a prominent position as an historian, and won 18 awards for her work on Thomas Jefferson, Sally Hemings. She says, Madison Hemings' memoirs must stand or fall on the basis of his credibility alone. To that end, it must be said that these memoirs are properly described as items of direct evidence that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were involved in a relationship. In other words, in spite of the numerous problems with the testimony, the biggest problem with the Madison Hemings testimony is that he's testifying in 1873, right, many years after Jefferson's death. Why didn't he say anything about Jefferson being his father before that? And, it's a problem. No other person has said, none of the other Sally Hemings' children have said anything about Jefferson being their father in all the years. Why is he waiting so long? Now, it's clear that, he had something to gain at the time. He probably was rewarded somewhat handsomely for his testimony in 1873 by editor Wetmore. So he certainly had something to gain. And we saw already that many of the claims that he made were false or at least spurious. And that being born in 1805, he's talking about events that happened much prior to his birth. So he wasn't a direct witness to any of the things that he claims, at least most of the things he claims, didn't directly witness. So his testimony would not be admitted in a court of law. So we have good reason to doubt some of the things, and the testimony should not be given much weight. Okay, what Gordon Reed is claiming is that the memoirs are properly described as items of direct evidence that Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings were involved. In other words, it's indirect testimony, but we need to treat it as direct testimony. Where does that come from? How do we get that? We get that because she just says it, right? And if you doubt her, you're probably a racist because she's an African-American scholar. Okay, she says there's mutual love between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. She says that a lot. And how do we know that? We don't even know if there's a relationship. Robert Turner, Professor Robert Turner from UVA, said everything we know about Sally Hemings can be put on a 3x5 card, and that's true. We know nothing about Sally Hemings. We know next to nothing about what happened to her when she was in France between 1784 and 1789. That's when Jefferson was there. She came in 1787, spent about 26 months there. Okay. She said Sally Hemings stayed at the L'Hôtel Languedoc, not the l'Abbaye Royale de Panthemont. Jefferson stayed at the Hôtel Languedoc, and it was a somewhat spacious place, but he had a number of attendants with him. Of course, his secretary, William Short, and two other people that stayed with him full time, and he was properly attended to by servants there. There wouldn't have been room, and there wouldn't have been need for Sally Hemings to be there. Why wouldn't Sally Hemings be at the l'Abbaye Royale de Panthemont with Maria Jefferson, his daughter, and his older daughter, Patsy, Martha Jefferson? She just asserts that without any evidence, without a scintilla of evidence. She talks about the negotiations that Madison Hemings. We saw reasonably that seems silly. Why would a man, one of the brightest statesmen for the United States, a minister to France, why would, and someone with tastes in women, he had tastes in beauty, and Sally Hemings as a child was probably very attractive. At least we have some accounts that said she was. But why would he fall for her? His wife was not only beautiful, but she was very skilled in the fine arts. She sang beautifully, and she played the pianoforte. He played the violin when they were courting, and they sang together and played together. He also fell in love with Maria Cosway in 1786 in France. She was an artist, a painter. She was a musician, and she was a composer. Sally Hemings was a girl between the ages of 14 and 16 while in France. She was a child. She certainly possessed no great skill in any of the fine arts. Though she may have been attractive, she was a child. There needs to be reason why Jefferson would fall in love with her and then beg her to stay with him in France. Now, there were laws in France that said a slave could get her freedom in France. We have no reason to think that the French people would have allowed, if Jefferson objected to Sally Hemings remaining behind, that the French people would allow her to stay behind since he was minister plenipotentiary. Secondly, what would be the motivation for her wanting to stay in France? She was a child at the time. She probably spoke very little of the French language, in spite of the fact that Gordon Reed makes her out to be fairly fluent in French. It seems silly. Probably couldn't read and write, so what sort of occupation could she have hoped to have gained? She probably would have been a servant at a wealthy household somewhere, or moderately wealthy household, and she would have been away from family and friends. There's no reason to think that she entertained or even went into negotiation with Jefferson. She claims that Jefferson was, Gordon Reed claims that Jefferson was Thomas Jefferson's chambermaid in Monticello. Absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. Now, this is kind of a cute quote. She says of why Sally Hemings did not accompany Thomas Jefferson in Washington. Gordon Reed says, living with her any place other than Monticello would have caused all sorts of complications, not the least of them cute babies running around who looked just like him. Really absurd comment. Just Sally Hemings wasn't in Washington because there was not an affair between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. Okay, and listen to these three claims here. She calls this she says, the rejection of the Sally Hemings story can be seen as a denial of black ties to the founding of the nation and a rejection of black birthright claims. 1. 2. White historians before her work, she says of them. Blacks have been treated as lumps of clay to be fashioned and molded into whatever image the given historian feels is necessary in order to make his point. And 3. If the relationship is true, she says, Sally Hemings gains some measure of power over Jefferson, while Jefferson is cut down to size. So she's got a political agenda. She wants to make, this is a Frankenstein monster. She wants to take somebody who was a nobody in Jefferson's life and make her a great person in history. And she wants to cut Thomas Jefferson down to size. There seems to be quite a bit of venom there. Last, we looked at the Thomas Jefferson Foundation claims. They start, that's my cat whining in the background. They start with Madison Hemings' testimony. The foundation says we have to take this as veridical. Okay, now notice what they say of the Thomas Jefferson Y chromosome from the study. They say that Eston Hemings had the Jefferson chromosome. This definitively refutes the claims by Jefferson's grandchildren, including Ellen Randolph Coolidge and her brother Thomas Jefferson Randolph, that either Peter or Samuel Carr, they could not agree on which one, was the father of Sally Hemings' children. It's an absurd claim. How do they refute that definitively? Only if Sally Hemings had one lover, and only if that lover was Thomas Jefferson. We don't know any of that. You can't just assume it. They claim Madison Hemings was described by a U.S. Census taker as the son of Thomas Jefferson in 1870. Well, if Madison is entertaining thoughts of Jefferson being his father, he probably is making it well known at the time that Jefferson was his father. Big deal. Israel Gillette Jefferson, formerly a slave at Monticello, corroborated Madison Hemings' claim in the same newspaper, referring to Sally Hemings as Thomas Jefferson's concubine. Now that was the third Life Among the Lowly installment in the same year, 1873, and this testimony was shot through by Thomas Jefferson's grandson, who refuted all the claims, many of the claims in the testimony, and even the Thomas Jefferson Foundation says very little about the legitimacy of that testimony. It's just properly filled with numerous factual errors. I'll talk about some as we go on. All right. Newspaper accounts in Chillicothe, Ohio in 1887 and 1902 recalled that Eston resembled Thomas Jefferson. How are they going to know this? Robert Turner says this was based on a statue in Washington that they had seen that was made from a two-dimensional picture of Thomas Jefferson, and the statue really doesn't look much like Thomas Jefferson. Eston may have looked much like Thomas Jefferson. We don't know. That testimony is in 1887, 1902. How are these people going to know what Thomas Jefferson looked like? You look at the various resemblances from portraits, paintings, from statues. They disagree quite a bit in what Jefferson looked like. So we don't really know which of them is the best likeness of Thomas Jefferson. So that, and if Eston did look a lot like Jefferson, that could be readily explained by his brother Randolph Jefferson being the father. All right. Thomas Jefferson freed slaves only in the Hemings line. That's true, but that's explicable because they had a great status. And why? Jefferson only freed slaves that looked very white, number one. And he freed slaves who had a good chance, in other words, who were skilled, who had a good chance of finding work, who could blend into a white community somewhere and had a chance of finding work. Okay, So, and the Hemings did have a special status at Monticello, even though Jefferson did not treat Sally Hemings with give her any special privileges, but they had light work and important work, and were treated better than other slaves at Monticello. And that's readily explained if Sally Hemings' father was the same father as his wife, Martha, the Wales. Okay, they say, Eston Hemings' descendants altered their family history, which was that Jefferson was Eston's father, to state that they were related to one of Thomas Jefferson's relatives in order to hide Eston Hemings' decision to change his racial identity when he moved to Wisconsin. Now, that's a very, very strange claim. So what they're trying to say is that there was a long, loud oral tradition that Eston was fathered by Thomas Jefferson, and Eston at some point changed it to say it was an uncle, it was a relative, not Jefferson, to hide his racial identity. How would that hide your racial identity? I have no idea. So this is just an ad hoc move by the foundation. The names of Sally Hemings' 4 surviving children, they say William Beverly Hemings, Harriet Hemings, James Madison Hemings, and Thomas Eston Hemings, suggest family ties to Thomas Jefferson. Now, the word suggest is a very, very weak claim, and there's not much to say about that. William Beverly Hemings, Harriet Hemings, how are these tied to Jefferson's line? I don't see that. That James Madison Hemings and Thomas Eston Hemings would have been included. That's fine. I mean, it was very common for slaves to name their children after members of the household family of masters, especially. It wouldn't be a surprise, with James Madison Hemings and Thomas Eston Hemings, Thomas probably named after Thomas Jefferson, to be named, to given names that were dear to Thomas Jefferson, just because the Hemings had a special status in Jefferson's household. Okay, let's look at evidence against the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. There's Thomas Jefferson on July 1, 1805. This is direct testimony. Jefferson writes in a cover letter to Levi Lincoln, "You'll perceive that I plead guilty to one of their," he's talking about the calumniators, "charges, that when young and single I offered love to a handsome lady. I acknowledge its incorrectness." Now, Jefferson's friend, John Walker, his wife was Betsy. John Walker went away to some negotiations at some point when Thomas Jefferson, when they both were young, to negotiate with the Indians. And there was some chance he would not come back alive. And he asked Jefferson in confidence to watch over his wife, take care of his wife in his absence. And presumably, Jefferson admits in this letter, this became an inflammatory charge, so a charge that was true, that Jefferson made a pass at Betsy Walker. Jefferson acknowledged that that is fact. Okay, he says this is the only thing. He says, I acknowledge its correctness, but it's the only charge of all the calumniators that I admit to. So it's direct testimony that he's directly conceding that he made a pass at Betsy Hemings, but he's saying this is the only thing of all the things that they've said that is true, which is a direct refutation of the Sally Hemings story, because it was being talked about many, many years before this. All right, there is the testimony of Edmund Bacon. Edmund Bacon was the overseer at Monticello. Edmund states, he says, find the slide here. Edmund says, he's talking about Sally Hemings' daughter, Harriet, and he said someone's claimed that Thomas Jefferson was the father of Harriet. And Edmund Bacon, who was the overseer from 1806 to 1822, said, she was not his daughter, she was blank's daughter. I know that. I have seen him come out of her mother's room many a morning when I went up to Monticello very early. Now, given that he was the overseer from 1806 to 1822, he's talking about an event that the birth of Harriet that happened prior to him being overseer, but he may have been in residence at Monticello prior to 1806. All he's saying is that I've seen a specific person other than Thomas Jefferson coming out of Sally Hemings' room many a morning when I get up. So he's implicating somebody other than Thomas Jefferson. This is important evidence that is generally given short shrift by people. Now we have the testimony of Abigail Adams on July 6, 1787, when Maria, Jefferson's daughter, and Sally Hemings, who was 14 at the time, Maria was 8, and they came aboard and they were accepted and spent some time with John and Abigail Adams in England as the ship arrived, bringing Maria and Sally Hemings with her to Europe. Abigail says, the girl she, in other words, Mary, has with her wants more care than the child and is wholly incapable of looking properly after her without some superior to direct her. Now this talks about the gross immaturity of Sally Hemings at the age of 14. So you expect us to believe, given her credibility as an eyewitness testimony, that somehow Sally Hemings, from the time she arrived in Europe, to sometime before she left, got such a degree of maturity and rationality that she was capable of negotiating with Thomas Jefferson and threatening to leave him and so forth. That seems too much to ask. Now we have another slave, Isaac Jefferson, who testifies in 1847. He said, old master's brother, Mas Randolph, was a mighty simple man, used to come out among black people and play the fiddle and dance half the night. Had much more sense than Isaac. Here we have a direct testimony of a slave seeing Thomas Jefferson's younger brother, Randolph Jefferson, hanging out with the black people, hanging out at Mulberry Row at Monticello quite often. So a lot of the reason why a lot of people think that Randolph Jefferson was the father. Now this is generally not given is given short shrift by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. So we have 4 direct testimonies that have a bearing on paternity here. And the Thomas Jefferson Foundation gives no direct testimony. 4 direct testimonies against 0, and yet they want to say it's a fact that there was a relationship, that he fathered all. And then we have some indirect testimony. Here we have Jefferson's granddaughter, Ellen Randolph Coolidge, who writes in 1858 to her husband, Mr. Southall and himself, and she's talking about her brother, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, young men together, heard Mr. Peter Carr say with a laugh that the old gentleman has to bear the blame for his and Sam's misdeeds. So here we have testimony indirect that the Carrs are implicated in some of the children, at least one child with Sally Hemings. Is there any reason to believe that they'd be telling an untruth? Again, this is not direct testimony, but we have some evidence implicating the Carrs. It's generated from that oral tradition. Sally Hemings may not have been, and I think it's highly unlikely that she had one lover. She probably had many lovers, like her mother, who had 12 children and 4 lovers. And this suggests, gives us some reason to think that the Carrs may have been fathers of other children of Sally Hemings. Then we have, I mentioned that Israel Gillette Jefferson's testimony in 1873 sort of confirms some of the stuff that Thomas Jefferson said. Life Among the Lowly, number 3 in the Pike County Republican. He states that he was born around 1797. If we follow Thomas Jefferson's records, he says he was born on 28 December 1800. And then Israel says, about the time Mr. Jefferson took his seat as president for a second term in 1805, he would be 5 years old at the time, I began the labors of life as a waiter at the family table till Mr. Jefferson died, was retained in Monticello, very near his person. He was never, there's no indication whatsoever that he was an attendant of Thomas Jefferson. He could not have been a waiter at Monticello in 1805 because he would have been just over 4 years old. He would not have even been 5 years old at the time, and that seems ridiculous to think that a 4-year-old boy would be treated as a waiter at Monticello. And we know at the time, he says that he wasn't even at Monticello at the time. Jefferson's Jefferson's grandson says that. So he wasn't even at Monticello. So the testimony is false. Then we have Henry Randolph, who was a biographer of Thomas Jefferson, one of the great early biographers. He writes to James Parton on June 1, 1858. He says, and he quotes something that Peter Carr, Jefferson's nephew, says. And Peter Carr presumably said, "Aren't you and I a couple of pretty fellows? To bring this disgrace upon poor old uncle who has always fed us, we ought to be blank by blank." And so the Carr brothers are discussing, and Peter Carr is, if the source is true, he's saying, old uncle, he's always fed us, and yet we have children with Sally Hemings, and everybody thinks he's the father. So he's getting, and Jefferson had nothing to say. Now on slaves running away, which is in Eston Hemings' testimony, granddaughter Ellen Randolph Coolidge on 24 October 1858 has this to say: "It was Jefferson's principle to allow such of his slaves as were sufficiently white to pass for white men, to withdraw quietly from the plantation. It was called running away, but they were never reclaimed. Their whereabouts was perfectly known, but they were left to themselves, for they were white enough to pass for white." So Jefferson had no problem with certain slaves who were skilled in white looking to run away and earn their freedom. So he was running a sort of overground railroad, as it were, at the time with certain slaves. He didn't free many slaves, but the laws in Virginia didn't permit that. And of course, there's always the claim that he didn't free very many slaves at the end of his lifetime. He couldn't have freed them for a couple of reasons. It was against the Virginia law, but we saw some reason to think that he wasn't really so worried about the Virginian law because he allowed some to run away. But secondly, he was so massively in debt by in our language, over $1 million in debt at the time, and no way of digging himself up out of that debt. Had he freed slaves prior to his death, and even, creditors would have come and taken his slaves as payment for some of that debt. Now let's look at a comparison pro and con for the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. Okay, I'm going to assess the claims, look at the biological evidence. The DNA study shows that Eston Hemings has Jefferson line male chromosome. That is very strongly confirmed. The DNA study rules out the Carrs in paternity of Eston Hemings. This is pro-hypothesis. That we know. That's strongly confirmed. Okay, that's pro-Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. Biological evidence, con-Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. The 1998 study shows Tom Woodson, the alleged first child of Sally Hemings, birthed in France, the one that Eston Hemings died shortly thereafter, but Tom says no. According to this legend, he didn't die, but his whereabouts were unknown. The 1998 study shows that Tom Woodson was not fathered by Thomas Jefferson. We know that. That's strongly confirmed. The DNA study shows Thomas Jefferson is a possible father of Eston Hemings, but does not single him out. Only Eston Hemings was tested. Eston had the Jefferson Y chromosome. Jefferson could be the father, could be his brother, I think it is, or one of his brother's children. He had 4 or 5 boys that lived with him, and 4 of whom could have been involved with Sally Hemings. It's possible. Now let's look at the eyewitness testimony. Eyewitness testimony pro Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. There is none. Eyewitness testimony con Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. The 1787 testimony of Abigail Adams on the immaturity of Sally Hemings, thereby showing that it's very likely she was in no position she could not intellectually have entered into negotiations with Thomas Jefferson. So that piece of Madison Hemings' testimony is false. Thomas Jefferson's own testimony in 1805 on the Walker affair, he said, "I had this affair. I promised, I entertained the notion of love to a handsome young lady. I acknowledge its incorrectness." And he says all the other allegations against me are untrue, namely the Sally Hemings affair is not true. The testimony of Isaac Jefferson in 1847 and the testimony of Edmund Bacon Edmund Bacon claims to have seen someone else coming out of Sally Hemings' room other than Thomas Jefferson. Isaac Jefferson's testimony in 1847. Isaac claims that Randolph Jefferson, Jefferson's brother, used to hang out with the black people, singing and dancing to all hours of the night on many occasions. So we have 4 bits of eyewitness testimony against the hypothesis, none for it, and yet it's treated as fact. How does that happen? Okay, non-eyewitness testimonies. There's the testimony of Madison Hemings in 1873. We found that to be extraordinarily weak. It's hard to believe that it could be foundational to the story that they tell, and Gordon Reed tells, and the story that is crafted, that is created, that is whipped up by the Thomas Jefferson Foundation. We have the testimony of Israel Gillette in 1873. This is extremely weak. Thomas Jefferson's grandson, Thomas Jefferson Randolph, refuted many of the claims immediately. And the foundation doesn't make too much of that. They say it corroborates the story, but they don't say much beyond that. It doesn't corroborate it. And the Madison Hemings testimony is weak. Okay. Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. We have the letter of Ellen Randolph Coolidge to her husband. And that's, it's not eyewitness testimony, but, that needs to be explained away by the pro-paternity people, by the foundation. They don't. They just, they don't say much about it. There is the letter of Henry Randolph to James Parton, implicating the Carrs in 1868. Again, this is not eyewitness testimony, but it needs to be explained away. They do not do that. Okay, other evidence. Madison Hemings listed at the Sun and the census. That's weak. The newspapers in Chillicothe in 1887 and 1902. Settings resembling, that doesn't do much. All the other stuff that is listed by the foundation and by Gordon Reed, these are all relatively weak arguments, weak reasons, with one exception, and that is the notion of the conception dates. That Thomas Jefferson, tracing back, looking at his whereabouts, and Jefferson notes the births of each of Sally Hemings' children in his memoranda book, and if we go back some 9 months, we found out that Thomas Jefferson, it is true that Thomas Jefferson was roughly around Monticello at the time that he would have needed to be the father of Sally Hemings' children. Now that is a needed condition for Jefferson to be father of all of Hemings' children, but it's not sufficient. It doesn't show. But then again, we don't know where Sally Hemings was. What we do know is Jefferson and Sally Hemings had to be together roughly 9 months prior to the birth of each child. That Jefferson was in Monticello doesn't show that they were together. We don't know where Sally Hemings was. Now, she may have been there each of the times of the births of the 5 known children. We don't know for sure. We just can't assume it. But this is a bit of evidence, the best argument that Jefferson fathered all. It by itself, it doesn't show much at all, but it's something that needs to be explained or at least considered by the people who think Jefferson wasn't the father of all Hemings' children. Now, there are some Thomas Jefferson hypothesis evidence I think that's very, very interesting, even though it's the absence of evidence. If Jefferson were the father of all Sally Hemings' children, there should have been, in almost 40 years of a relationship, somebody who saw something somewhere. Monticello was flooded with people at the time. Someone would have to have seen something. You can't just, something would betray Jefferson's passion for Sally Hemings. Now, secondly, in his accounts, in all of his writings, we see very few references to Sally Hemings in his account books, nothing anywhere else, really. If he's in love with Sally Hemings, so passionate in love that he'd have to negotiate with her to come back with this child, you'd find something somewhere. Something would slip out. Jefferson would be saying something like in a letter to Madison, Maria's attendant, Sally Hemings, is just great. She treats you so well. There's nothing like that whatsoever. We can't just assume that because there's nothing there, that their letters were burned or whatever, all these sorts of silly stories that are made up. Again, there's no corroborative testimony by other Sally Hemings' children. Why is it that Madison Hemings alone, and he does so in 1873 only, come out and say Jefferson was my father. It's interesting that we have in censuses, we have noticed that Eston Hemings was 6'1", Thomas Jefferson was 6'2.5", and Madison Hemings was 5'6", 5'6.5". Such a big disparity in the height of Madison Hemings and Eston Hemings. It may be that some reason to think that they were not fathered by the same person. And we have other con evidences. Thomas Jefferson Randolph's published refutation of Israel Gillette's testimony. Now let's look at the methodologies adopted by the pro-paternity and the con-paternity people on behalf of the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis. The pro-paternity people brag that there's a historical consensus that Jefferson, by historians that Jefferson has fathered all the children. This doesn't say much at all. Consensus might sound really sort of interesting, but it's based on, the sort of stuff they put out at the foundation. It's widely read, widely accepted, and a lot of people uncritically accept Jefferson's paternity without going through, as we've done today, all the available evidence. They take the authority of Annette Gordon Reed to be unimpeachable. She writes 4 chapters in her second book, The Hemings and Monticello, about the probable course of events in France and the relationship between the two, and talking about it be a relationship of love, of mutual love, and Sally Hemings be so beautiful and talented. We know nothing about that. Gordon Reed is taken as an unimpeachable authority. She ought not to be. In fact, I think it's very likely that most of everything she says is a matter of pure fiction. The fact that in their own methodologies, the pro-paternity people take the arguments to the contrary, evidence to the contrary, they don't address it. They refuse to address it. They don't look at alternative hypotheses, which is strange. They assume Sally Hemings was monogamous. Her mother had 4 lovers and 12 children. Why would Sally Hemings necessarily be? Can't assume it. You can't work it into the equation. We need evidence for it. We look at Gordon Reed's assertion that Madison Hemings' 1873 testimony must be treated as fact, because if not, we're taking a black person. We're not treating him fairly. We are asserting that his testimony can't be trusted because he's black. That's not true. He was at least 7/8 white, might have been 15/16 white. So we don't know which, but it's not a question of race here. It's a question of expediency. Did Eston have something to gain? And there are numerous flaws with the testimony. Flawed testimony and a testimony that is non-eyewitness can't be taken that seriously. Okay, what about the Thomas Jefferson paternity? They assert that most, and I'm with them here, that most of the pro-paternity evidence can be explained away when it's addressed. Okay, there are several plausible, we're going to look at a couple, alternative hypotheses which accommodate possibilities of Sally Hemings not being monogamous, as he wanted, that she was polygamous. Okay, we also know that Jefferson's relatives, his brothers, his nephews probably would have come when Jefferson came back from the vice presidency or the presidency to Monticello. We have testimony in letters that there was nobody in residence at Monticello during those times. His house was vacated, and that when he came back, people certainly would have flocked to see him. His brother, who lived only some 20 miles away, would have come to see him at times, and so forth. So, we have that evidence. Now let's look at competing hypotheses. I don't have too much more to say. The Randolph Jefferson hypothesis. Randolph Jefferson fathered Eston Hemings and all the other children of Sally Hemings. Now this is at least a possibility. It needs to be entertained. I think it's a stronger possibility than the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis, that Thomas Jefferson fathered all. We have Israel Gillette's account, right, of Randolph Jefferson visiting the slave quarters at Monticello often, and singing and dancing in the night. So that accommodates that direct bit of testimony. And then we have what might be called the Sally Hemings not monogamous hypothesis, which we can state that Sally Hemings' children were fathered by more than one person, which is a direct denial of the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis that Thomas Jefferson fathered all. We have some evidence for that. The notion that Eston Hemings was 6'1" tall, while Madison was 5'6" tall. There's the oral tradition inculcating the Carrs that from the grandchildren saying, and from the biographer, the Jefferson biographer, Henry Randolph, that says that the Carrs were involved. That indicates that the Carrs were involved in paternity. So if Eston Hemings was fathered by someone in the Jefferson line, it could be the Carrs were involved in paternity of, say, Madison Hemings or other. All right. Now, we have, and last what I want to say is if you go to Monticello's webpage, you'll find numerous instances of what might be called in philosophy the argumentum ad ignorantiam. In other words, there's no evidence for some claim P, so not P is true. And this might be just simply called dodging bullets. What the foundation does, and Annette Gordon-Reed is no stranger to this as well, is wanting to claim that there's no evidence for something here. We must take this as evidence for its opposite, for its denial. Consider this from Annette Gordon-Reed in her 1997 book. She writes, if one considers Jefferson and his family's pattern of writing letters and the relationship that Sally Hemings bore to the Jeffersons, particularly in France, there's something strange about the scarcity of references to her in their correspondence. One might expect that once during the 26 months that Sally Hemings was in France, he would have let Elizabeth know about her youngest daughter. So Jefferson fails to write anything about Sally Hemings during the spell in his correspondence while the two are in France together. So she wants to say that's strange, given that she's acknowledging there's something weird about that. But then she adds, do actions and circumstances speak louder than words or the lack of words? In other words, they were having sex. There's no need to write anything to anybody. And she writes again, members of the Jefferson family offered the Carr brothers as the likely fathers to explain why Sally Hemings' 4 children looked so much like Thomas Jefferson. Eliminating the Carr brothers does not erase the children's close resemblance to Jefferson. Some other as yet undesignated Jefferson relative must be substituted, or Thomas Jefferson remains the most likely father. In the absence of any contemporary source suggesting that another relative might have been the father, or any present-day indication that it might have been someone else, such speculation seems a desperate attempt to absolve Jefferson. What she's arguing is that anybody like myself today who wants to claim that the father of Eston Hemings was likely Randolph Jefferson, it's just a desperate attempt, right? You're trying to show at all costs it couldn't have been Thomas Jefferson, right? So she's arguing, in effect, that there's no evidence of any other persons. The fact that we have no direct evidence or any serious evidence of anybody else being implicated in paternity, it must be Thomas Jefferson, right? It must be the Carrs, Thomas Jefferson, or somebody else. There's no evidence of anybody else. It must be the Carrs or Thomas Jefferson. The 1998 study ruled out the Carrs, but it only ruled out the Carrs in the paternity of Eston. So she wants to say, Jefferson definitely fathered also his children. And I give you this little nugget by Joe Ellis, it was written on Thomas Jefferson, and he says, bringing Randolph, he's talking about bringing Randolph into the picture and saying he must be the father of Eston Hemings. And Ellis writes, he is brought forward now because he fits the genetic profile. Historians of the lost cause syndrome will recognize the poignant fusion of sincerity and futility at work here. What he's arguing is that this is just like lost cause thinking. You want to say, why did the South lose the Civil War? They really didn't lose the Civil War. Same thing with Randolph. Now, we lost the case, with Eston Hemings having the Jefferson Y chromosome. It seems to point the finger very, very neatly at Thomas Jefferson. Well, the pro-Jefferson people have found it out. It could have been Randolph. And he says, this is just like the lost cause. They're struggling, they're groping to find some way of exculpating Thomas Jefferson by inculpating Randolph Jefferson, his brother. Now, I disagree with very much. This is not futility. This is not lost cause thinking. What we're looking at him because he fits the genetic profile, because it explains just as neatly as the similarities of Eston Hemings to physical similarities of Eston Hemings to Thomas Jefferson. That would be explained by Thomas Jefferson's brother, Randolph Jefferson, being the father. But it's because he fits the genetic profile that we're looking at him. We need to look at Randolph. We need to look at his sons. We need to look at all possible contenders, and we need to look at Thomas Jefferson as well. It's not futility. It's just doing things the right way. Now, I want to throw out the following conclusions here. Okay, it is more likely than not that Randolph Jefferson was the father of Eston Hemings. Okay, I think that's much more likely than Thomas Jefferson. It is more likely than not that Sally Hemings had children by more than one lover. I think the evidence points starkly in that direction. We're talking about probabilities here, not certainties. If that's the case, if those two things are the case, it's very likely that the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis is false. Okay, I think, if it had been stated that Thomas Jefferson is the father of Eston and he may be the father of the others, a much more weakly articulated claim, okay, that's fine, but they go out and say Jefferson was the father of all, and they say in June of 2018 it's a fact. Okay, the most likely hypothesis is that Sally Hemings, the hypothesis that Sally Hemings was not monogamous, which is consistent with Thomas Jefferson being the father of Eston Hemings or Randolph Jefferson or some other Jefferson. But it commits us to Sally Hemings not having more than one paramour. I want to conclude this lengthy discussion, and I hope you've enjoyed it, with just a thought. Why has the Thomas Jefferson Foundation, which has made such a poor case for Thomas Jefferson's paternity as regards or vis-a-vis the hypothesis of Jefferson fathering all of Sally Hemings' children, it's so weakly supported, there's no direct testimony, and there's 4 bits of direct testimony that point against it. Why have they asserted that this is a fact? My suspicion is it's just political motivation. This is sort of postmodernist history at play here, that there really is nothing to the methods of history, that historians, and themselves included, are at liberty to do whatever the hell they want to do with the evidence. If they want to ignore evidence which is telling against their hypothesis, they're free to do so. Postmodernist historians rather loudly argue that all history is fiction because the past is remote. We don't have direct access to the past, so anything we write is going to be a narrative frame, and it's going to be fictive. Yes, the past is in the past, but there is archaeological evidence that has a bearing on it. There is written testimony that has a bearing on it to which we have access. And the notion of postmodernist history, the notion that all history is narrative fiction, is just bullshit. I suspect that they're writing from, Peter Onuf certainly writes from a postmodernist tack. It is the mind of Thomas Jefferson. He tells us that we can't know anything about Thomas Jefferson. We can't do anything but create fictions. He says the only thing we want to avoid is putting Jefferson on a pedestal. And in his book, what he does is he talks about the very many great narratives that are created by Jefferson scholars, almost all of which are negative depictions of Jefferson. And we know Onuf is no stranger to hating Thomas Jefferson vehemently. So that's the whole thing. It just seems to me the Thomas Jefferson Foundation is making gobs of money, research grant money, by playing up the Sally Hemings myth, like saying that the Thomas Jefferson hypothesis is fact when it's very, very likely just fiction and false. They don't care. They are themselves in a position where they think they're fighting on behalf of racial justice. In doing so, what they're doing is making up their own history for their own reasons. It seems to me, if they see themselves as champions of morality, it seems to me that they're just the opposite, that the champions of immorality and disregarding veridicality, disregarding truth in what they've been aiming to do. So I hope you've enjoyed the video. I know it's been a lengthy video, but I hope it's also been informative. I just want you to think, if you go on a tour at Monticello or Poplar Forest area and you have a tour guide say, okay, this is where Sally Hemings lived, and Jefferson was the father of all the children, you'll be at least in a strong position to say, that's bullshit. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoyed this presentation.